This video may be a month late, but it's better late than never, right? Today we're going to look back at 2023 and my top 10 favorite tanks that I played in that year. Just like last year, this isn't the best 10 tanks that came out last year. This is a list of my favorite tanks that I played last year. Your list will obviously vary, as you probably played way different tanks than I did and enjoyed differently as well. But without further ado, let's get into my top 10 of 2023. Starting off, we have one that I played quite late into the year, the Senlac. This tier 8 premium British light tank has some quite interesting statistics. For a light tank, it goes 65 kilometers an hour forward. It's got 1050 HP and 400 meters of base view range. And it's got a quick firing gun that does 180 alpha. It's a 20 pounder and I don't know what that converts to in millimeters, but the most interesting thing about this tank is its HE rounds that are called grenades. The grenades on this vehicle do less damage than their standard rounds, which is atypical of HE rounds, but it increases your fire rate by a lot. Yes, it's only 50 millimeters of HE pen for 80 damage, but that increase in fire rate really lets it pick apart other light tanks that might try and get too close to you. And that's the other thing, they do have to get close to you because it only has, I believe, 150 meters of range, meaning you can't snipe with the HE, which is totally fine. But when a light tank aggresses you when you're trying to do your job, you get to take them out quite easily, and that's what I really liked and enjoyed about this vehicle. Recently too, I put out a video on this tank on the channel, so go check that out if you're interested, but that, for now, is the Senlac. Next up is another light tank that I really enjoyed this year, that I 3-marked around the beginning of the year, the Lykan T71. This tank might just look like the Tech Tree tank, but it's way better. It's got better standard pen, slightly faster max speed that doesn't really matter, and 10 more meters view range, as well as better camo, which makes this thing quite strong, which is why it's one of the only tanks in the game with anti-preferential matchmaking, meaning it can never be top tier. And now while that might sound like a bad thing for the tank, it's actually sort of a good thing if you think about it, because as a light tank, you're very capable of beating bottom tier. You can be stealthy, you can spot for your team, and you can rely on your spotting damage giving you your damage values that you need to 3-mark it. Being top tier just means there's less damage potential to be had. So guaranteeing that I won't be top tier means I'll always have more damage potential in my matches. And with the upgraded benefits that this tank has over the Tech Tree tank, it performed very well at being bottom tier most of the time. This was a tank that was gifted to me by a friend Hippo a long time ago, so 3-marking it was a thanks to him. Keeping with the light tank theme, we have the Fraternity, or the Fraternite. I'm not so sure what it is, but the Char MLE 75 at tier 9. Now this vehicle on PC only has one gun option, but as we like to cop out over here on console, we gave this thing a regular 6-round autoloader. But that's not what I like about the vehicle. Yes, the 6-shot autoloader has higher damage per shot and better penetration values, but using that gun I sort of feel is a cop-out. So I much prefer the original design intention with the 3-round burst autoloader. It's got 2 shots in a clip, and each shot shoots 3 at a time. For 200 damage apiece, that's 600 damage per shot, 1200 in a clip. Obviously, with your 6-round autoloader having 270, that's more damage potential per clip, but it keeps the intra-clip of this 2-shot autoloader on the 6-shot. So while the 2-shot autoloader has a 3.5-second intra-clip, the 6-shot has that as well, meaning it takes much longer to dump out those 6 rounds. But this tank needs that fun factor, the interesting aspect of the 2-shot burst autoloader. Otherwise, it's just another light tank with 380 meters base view range, which is not that good for a light tank. This tank also came out around the time of the AAT-60, so I know not many people picked this up because they had just picked up the AAT-60, which is a way better tier 9. But if this ever comes out again, I highly recommend you give it a go. And please, use the gun it was intended to have, because that's the one you'll have the most fun in. Another tier 9 on this list is the Chieftain prototype. I don't remember when this vehicle came out exactly, but I do remember playing it while I was still a community contributor and having it on rental. I also chose this tank to be my final Christmas gift from Wargaming. Now, typically tier 9s have worse DPM than tier 10s, less HP, and yada yada, and this is no different. That doesn't mean the tank can't hold its own in tier 10 battles. It does have that very good 10 degrees of gun depression and turret armor that a chieftain is known for. So it doesn't lack in that department. Everywhere else where it does lack, it's understandable because it's a tier 9. But overall, I really enjoyed this tank because to me it felt more fair and interesting to fight in and against, as opposed to the chieftain, which is just an easy tank to play in my opinion. I also really just like the look of this thing. It looks quite interesting. As you can clearly see the chieftain in its design, but it also just looks naked. That's the vibe I get from it, is it looks naked. But overall, one of the more enjoyable and balanced tier 9s of the year. Let's continue our discussions on heavy tanks with the Leman Russ. This tank is one of the Warhammer tanks that came out during that event at the beginning of the year. And this was the only one that was not a skin brought over from PC. The Leman Russ is a tank in the Warhammer universe and has a 120mm gun, canonically, despite not looking like it. And this thing has 500 alpha, so it really feels more like a 130mm, but without the overmatching capabilities of a 130mm. That's probably the only aspect of the vehicle I don't like. Everything else feels great. It's a quite weirdly compact vehicle, and even though it has 7 degrees of gun depression, it feels like a lot less because of how tall you are. 2500 HP sort of puts it in the super heavy territory as well, which I think it fits quite well in. The only other thing I don't like about the tank being its low standard penetration, really forcing you to shoot premium, and even that's pretty low at 304, but it is a PCR. Overall though, it hits its shots quite well, and it can dish out some damage. The armor profile too is one of those things that, since you don't see it too much, and since it was a brand new tank, and it doesn't really have the tropes of most tanks in this game of a lower plate and a cupola. Yes, it does have a cupola, but its weaknesses are more so its extra gun sponson that's not really a gun despite us having multi-turrets. These extra guns on its hull do not actually fire, and its face sort of is much easier to pen than its cupola. But this tank will get you a lot of block damage since most people haven't fought it. Kind of like the 2684, where it's got great armor, but it's easily killable if you know what to do. But since most players don't encounter these vehicles, when they finally do, it's sort of allowed to do well because of that aspect. But even when I run up against people who do know how to pen this vehicle, because I am a super heavy with 2500 HP, as long as I'm not going up against the meta 183mm, I'm still gonna win that fight. It felt very fair to play, and it was the only vehicle I recommended out of the Warhammer line, as the other 3 should not have been skins. But we won't delve into that because this is a top 10 video, not a Cones ranting video. I also want to mention that the Leman Russ is one of those tanks that I've gotten 10,000 plus damage in, and that video you can also find on the channel. So with that, we're going to move on to the next heavy tank on the list, that being the 113. The 113 is a tank that has been featured on this channel quite a fair few times, and that's for good reason. This tank got reforged, and although that was in 2022, I did a lot of my playing in 2023. What did they give it in that reforge? Well, they gave it aim time, health, better ammo capacity, but most importantly, reload. So now the tank had much better DPM, more HP to play with, and more ammo to utilize. And that made this tank feel like something very special to me. It made it feel like a Tiger 1 at tier 10. Although it's not a super heavy, it's close to it in that HP value. So it's sort of got inflated HP like the Tiger 1 has. The reason I make the comparison is because the Tiger 1's identity is that it's got mediocre armor. Even when trying to angle it, you're very boxy and flat. So you have inflated HP to make up for that lack of armor, and you have a great gun with insane DPM. Which is what this tank sort of feels like to me. Yes, this tank obviously has better armor than the Tiger 1 tier for tier, but it still gets penned quite easily. And so having that inflated HP feeling and that DPM makes it feel like a Tiger 1 to me. And I love it. Would I recommend it for everyone though? No. It's not an easy tank to play, especially with the lack of gun depression, and having more gun depression over the sides means you have to play in some quirky styles and know map layouts to be able to perform the best to your gun depression's ability. But that doesn't hold it back for me, and I love it for that. Genuinely one of my favorite tanks of all time, not just of 2023. But before this video becomes a love letter to the 113, let's move on to some tank destroyers. My first ever tank review on the channel was for the Shpatuk TVP 100. And the reason I made that video was because of how much the tank spoke to me. How good it was. It has a 100mm gun, with the alpha of a tier 8 100mm, but the HE alpha of a tier 10 100mm, with 100mm of pen on that HE as well. And with a quick reload, it can dish out a lot of DPM. It's quite nimble as well, not the quickest thing, and it is quite big with no armor, but it is stealthy enough to make up for that. But when I say no armor, it doesn't mean that it can get HE'd easily. It still has enough armor to absorb most HE shells, but with 100mm of pen for itself, it can really hurt a lot of other tanks that can't absorb HE well. Especially the newly buffed Waffle E100. The Shpatuk can still HE pen the Waffle quite reliably, which is fantastic, because again, this thing has tier 10 HE levels of alpha. Yes, 420 alpha might not seem like a lot in theory. In practice, the DPM allows it to really shine, and the 100mm just makes it much more forgiving. You'll eat up other tank destroyers like the SU-130PM, the Scorpion, the Canonian Jagdpanzers, but they'll struggle to eat you up with their HE, because again, this thing is paper for standard rounds, but it is not paper for HE. I can't stress it enough. The tank is just the perfect balance of DPM, camo, speed, while not all being too much in everything. And that HE is just the cherry on top of a perfectly made tank. Now, if I were to be perfectly honest, I might be a little biased about my love towards this tank, because this is the tank that earned my first true Kalabanovs. And I say true as my first real one. I just waited out the timer on an assault match. This one, I actually killed everybody in it. So whether it be the Kalabanovs keeping this tank afloat in my eyes, this tank is still amazing. If it's available at any point in the store on discount or free XP, I highly recommend you go and pick this tank up. Now, moving on from the premium tank destroyer Shpatuk, we have the tier 10 tech tree Badger. The first time I played this tank was this year, and it's exactly what I expected. I played the Tortoise so long ago, and it had great DPM, but it has a cupola weakness. The Badger's cupola-less. It's not there. Yes, it's got some weak little cheek areas if you shoot heat, but while at maximum gun depression, even that's going to be quite difficult. And with 10 degrees of gun depression, and a lower plate that's easy to hide, and with the best tier 10 DPM, this tank is just amazing. Yes, it's not the fastest, and it's not even the sneakiest, but you don't need that. You don't need that when you can pick apart any tank on a ridgeline that even looks at you. The meta around tier 10 is maybe why more people don't play the Badger, because, well, even a hull down tank can get HE'd by an Avery for 600 damage. And even a hull down tank can't really take a 183 round no matter what round it's shooting. But if you don't let that happen, the enemy's going to really struggle to take you out. I can't forget to mention too that it's got 390 base view range, which is on the higher end of tank destroyers, and 2100 HP means you have some HP to play with. And of course, slow, non-turreted tank destroyers aren't for everybody, and the 268 does exist as an easier to play tank destroyer with no turret. The Badger still just holds its own. If you haven't gotten this vehicle, it's on the same line as the Death Star. And yeah, a lot of people go for the 4005, but head down this line. It'll be worth it in the end. You get two tanks, one that's very meta, and one that's just a super solid tank. Speaking of the 268, we have not the 268, the 263, the YOLO wagon as some people might call it. This tank surprised me because it sort of doesn't look like a tank that has armor, but it does. And it's not just the armor that was surprising. It really is quite nimble with good camo as well. And 550 alpha on a tank destroyer is quite an interesting feeling. And you can play this tank really any way you want. You can be aggressive, you can side scrape, you can play in the back and snipe. And it does quite well at all of those things. meaning no matter what map you get, you're not at a disadvantage in the YOLO wagon. Of course, it being a Russian tank, it only has 4 degrees of gun depression, not even 5, but if you learn how to make that gun depression work for you, this tank can do it all. This tank definitely deserved a spot on this list, but there's nothing more to say than it's just a solid all-rounder, really. And it's not like one of those tanks, too, like Badger, where the grind to it's going to be annoying. The tanks leading up to this vehicle are quite good, especially the Tier 9. And so you won't be struggling on your way to get a great Tier 10. You'll be doing great along the entire way. And that's something else to take into account when talking about Tier 10 vehicles. Now, before we get to what might be my favorite tank of the year, we have some honorable mentions. First one being the Mantis, the first medium tank on this list. This was a Tier 8 premium that came out during the season where they were adding more mercenary tanks. And this tank feels very similar to one that many people probably already know, the Borovsk. While the Borovsk I classify as a light tank in my eyes, just in the medium tank class, the Mantis sort of does feel like a true medium tank scout. It's got the gun and turret of a medium tank, so it's got the penetration of a medium tank. And although it has more view range than the Borovsk, it has less camo. And having less camo means less ability to get into light tanks' ranges and spot out their teammates. So that's where the thought of it's more of a medium tank scout than it is a light tank classified as a medium comes in for me. Does that mean it's not as good as the Borovsk? No, not by any means. This tank is just as good, if not slightly worse than the Borovsk, but it makes up for that with slightly having armor. Using your gun depression on a ridgeline, the T-69 turret will bounce if you're not giving up your cheeks. And that's something the Borovsk cannot boast. Now, why I really like this tank, the reason it makes the honorable mentions is because of that comparison to the Borovsk. It feels a bit too strong. And I don't know how we would dial it back, but I didn't want this to make it on my top 10 because of that fact. So, for now, it's an honorable mention. The only other medium on this list is the UDES 1516. And the reason it's an honorable mention is because it's not as good as it could be. The 121 Chinese medium tank is one of the only other 440 alpha hitting guns on a medium tank at tier 10. And it got a substantial reload buff, way better than the UDES here. The UDES has the worst view range of any medium tank, but the best camo. And the reason for that is because it can work bridges like none other. But it still has a cupola, so I don't see it as being insane. And of course, being able to work those ridges is due to your automatic siege mode. And that is what makes this tank not as good as it could be. Yes, the siege mode is amazing. But the siege mode in console also fucks you up a lot. It will randomly tick, it will randomly bounce, it will randomly make you miss your shots. And having that inconsistency is what made this tank become an honorable mention. Otherwise, if siege mode, automatic siege mode, was perfect, if it didn't screw your shots over randomly whenever it decides to, then this tank definitely would have made it onto the list. Also too, if it had better DPM, it also probably could have made it on the list even with the automatic siege mode problem. That doesn't mean I didn't like it. I love this tank, and I really, really hope that it either gets the DPM it deserves, or we take a look at the automatic siege mode and make it much more consistent and much less annoying to play with. So far in the 2 honorable mentions, we have a tank that's too strong to be on the list, and we have a tank that's not strong enough to be on the list. Well, the next one follows the former. The E5 is a DPM king, and we've been buffing 120mm at tier 10 to have really good DPM. And the E5, I believe, got 2 buffs this year to its DPM. This has always been one of my favorite tanks in the game, but it took me a long time to play it again after getting it so many years ago. And that's because I've always wanted to 3-mark this tank, and so I was always worried about doing poorly. But now that they've buffed it twice, I had to give it a go. And it is great. There is no denying it that it is a great vehicle. The cupola's never bothered me because you can wiggle your turret quite well, and it is not that weak. But regardless of that, the E5's always had a soft spot in my heart, as it was my first tier 10 tank that I got in the game. 8 degrees of gun depression, great hull armor, a great turret, a cupola that you have to wiggle for. It just takes the right amount of skill and the right amount of know-how to make a tank work like this. And it ain't a slouch either. And now that it's got the DPM, even if you get pen in your cupola, you could just rip your opponents apart for doing so. You can really punish the enemy. The E5 is also probably the vehicle that I would recommend to new players the most, as the grind is just the most forgiving and the most basic. And so I would highly recommend that anybody and everybody go and get this vehicle if you don't have it already. Now that we're through with the honorable mentions, let's get to my favorite tank that I played in 2023. And that's a fairly recent one, the 114 SP2. Released in the last season of the year, it was the level 100 paid pass reward vehicle, and I had been waiting for this thing for a while. I'm a sucker for Chinese tanks. I don't know what it is, but I feel like they have the right balance of being good but not being too good, where it takes some know-how to make them work. A 650 Alpha tank destroyer. What other tank destroyer can you think of with 650 Alpha? The 2684. And well, that tank's not that much fun to play. But the 114, the 650 Alpha, great penetration values, 390 V range, top of the tank destroyers at tier 10, 2000 HP, decent camo, a 152mm gun for overmatching. This tank's amazing. I love this tank. 7 degrees gun depression, but paper thin armor in most cases. You will get A-read, and that is a problem, but I really was just looking forward to this tank because I just think it looks great. I don't know what it is about a boxy Chinese tank, but it just looks amazing to me. The only issue that I currently have with it is that the 2685 is a better tank in every regard to this vehicle, and that was handed out for free to players a long time ago. The 2685 has better alpha, better DPM, better penetration values, better speeds, better camo, better armor. The only thing the 2685 lacks compared to this is gun depression, but 5 to 7 degrees isn't that big of a jump to really make you able to work ridge lines. If this was 8 degrees, that would be a more significant jump, but this thing doesn't have the upsides it needs to better against a 2685. Now, does that mean I want this thing to be buffed? No. 2685 needs to be nerfed, as well as other vehicles. But regardless of that, which I also pointed out in my review of this vehicle, this was the second tank I reviewed, it's still an amazing tank. And it is also now my highest damage tank in World War II, which is probably why it comes as my favorite tank of last year. I did 11,000 something damage in it. Cone should know the value exactly, but you'll see in that review because that game is in it if you want to go and watch that one. But overall, fantastic tank. If you didn't get to earn it, if you didn't get to finish your season pass, or even buy the season pass and finish it, I feel really bad for you, because it's a very fun tank. And I would really recommend next time it is available, hopefully for free XP, that you do pick it up if you have enough. That has been my top 10 tanks of 2023. Leave yours down below in the comments, and I'll be sure to see what you guys picked out. Again, this wasn't the best tanks of 2023, so don't leave me your meta picks. Leave me the tanks you enjoy playing. If they are the meta picks, then so be it. But I really look forward to seeing a really diverse and creative set of vehicles down there in the comments. With that, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.